Welcome back to another episode. Now, today I'm going to dive into structural balance. I often speak about it and have conversations with people about it, but what is it? If you've never really heard of the concept structural balance before, let's break it out today. I honestly think it's one of the most important part of the training process, and I want to give a little bit of value and a little bit of context as to why I believe that to be true. When we look at structural balance, in a sense, structural balance is training all the smaller moving parts of the system that make your whole body work together. Now, when we look at conventional training, we often focus on big compound movements. We focus on squats, lunges, pressing, pulling, but beneath the external layer, we have all these stabilizing muscles and smaller muscle groups. Now, yes, they may not get the biggest adaptation in terms of fatigue, in terms of building muscle, in terms of energy expenditure, but they are the glue that holds the system together. Now, to put into context here, when we think of training, right, we get down to the absolute minute detail. And let's think about nutrition for a second. We focus on what's the best carbohydrate to have pre-training. What's the timing that we should have it? When do we ingest protein? Should we limit fat intake around training time so that we get the carb into the system and we can actually utilize it? We go into such minute details about nutrition, for instance. When we look at strength training, we're looking at the perfect timing, the perfect exercises, the accessory exercises that actually pair up with that. But then often the thing that's never thought about or even discussed is the body, the function of the body, how it works together as an ecosystem. Now that is structural balance. So structural balance, in a nutshell, we need to have a way that we look at the body across a year where we can sort of phase through different types of exercises which offset some of the training we do or pull the system back together. Now, any sort of training, whether it's for strength, hypertrophy, it's a triathlete, whatever it is we do, it is very cyclic. We do the same things over and over and over again. Now, we develop strength. We build, a great amount of progress in these activities and these skills that we do. But the issue with that is for every input we have another side. And that is where structural balance plugs the hole. If I was to do 1,000 squats, I would probably need to do 1,000 hip extensions on the other side to balance this out. But often when we look at training programs, that isn't the case. Now, if you want to have a strong and capable body that moves in whatever type of training you do, the biggest line in the sand that stops you making progress is being in pain. Mentally, you want to push, but physically, you're actually being limited and held back by the fact that you can't perform what you want to do. Now, that is someone that actually cares and wants to make progress is terrible. You don't want to be stuck in this type of situation. So, structural balance, what I believe, it fills that gap. Now, there is no way to prevent an injury. No way. But there are a lot of things that you can do that minimize your chances of getting an injury or sustaining an injury during training. Now, when we look at someone training, if you fail a lift or you miss a lift or you fail because of fatigue, you don't fail because of a strength. You fail because of a weak point. So that's something really interesting. So we also need to place effort on training these weaker, smaller components, because under a max load or under huge fatigue, under a set of 10 squats or something, you're going to gravitate to the point, the weakest point in your system, which with some corrective structural balance training, over time, you can actually make those weak points a strength. So let's dive into it. So conventional training. I want to have a look at a few examples here and I want to show you where it falls short. So if we have a look at the training world, there's a principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. It's called SAID. That is a principle that so many coaches live by. And basically it's saying that if you want a certain type of outcome, you need to train in a certain type of way. So if you want to get better at squatting, you need to squat. If you want to get better at running, you need to run. Now that makes a ton of sense, right? But with that, sometimes we actually get so specific with our training programs that we just miss the system as a whole. So, you know, we squat and squat and squat and squat, and that's awesome, but you become really imbalanced. Or a triathlete, you know, you look at them, they're stuck on a bike for hours on end, or they're stuck running hours on end. They are patterns that we do over and over and over again. And from that, there is going to be a flow-on effect. So if we have a look at, probably the main areas that's relevant to this population is, let's have a look at strength training. So strength training, we're squatting, we're pressing, we're rowing, we're doing all these big compound movements, right? Awesome exercises. But if we have a look at the lower body, for instance, often we don't train the ankle and the calf as a foot and the foot as a complex together in terms of strength and stability. We do a terrible job of managing the hamstrings and the glutes in the posterior chain. You know, like often, you know, if we have a look at strength training and we look at gyms, we often do RDLs or hamstring curls. But not to get too geeky, we've got knee flexion where you bend the knee. You've got bent knee hip extension, a hip thrust. We've got straight knee hip extension, such as a back extension. And in a lot of programs, a lot of those movement patterns never actually get addressed at all. So if we look at the upper body, we've got the rotator cuff. You know, you see everyone in the gym doing rotator cuff exercises, but are they ever really progressed? The actual direct scapular work that we do, where we lift our arms up overhead, or we need a combined rib and shoulder blade thing going on, like catching a ball or whatever. Do we ever actually train those type of qualities? The reality is probably not, because we're doing our rows, we're doing our presses, we're doing all these big compound movements. So if we have a look at strength training as a whole, if we look at squat, bench, deadlift, presses, rows, we don't really target a lot of these smaller muscle groups. Now, when we have a look at structural balance, what we want to do is plug the gaps in that. If we have a look at functional fitness, for instance, and we have a look at the style of training, a lot of it is really anterior loaded, like front loaded, front squats, high bar squats, wall balls, pull-ups. You know, we've got all these big compound movements, but often these gyms and these functional fitting setups don't have a lot of equipment in terms of like accessory equipment, like isolated stuff. So often you're doing a lot of these big bang for your buck type exercises, but you're not really doing any of the small stuff. And then the example that I was talking about before with running, if you're running constantly, everything is forward. Yes, you're stretching out the hamstring, but you're not really training your glutes. You're not training anything on the back. You're not really training rotation or taking your arm up overhead. So for a runner or someone that's a triathlete, we need to be looking at going, oh, well, what are they doing over and over and over again? And how do we offset that with structural balance for their actual day-to-day training program so that they can actually show up better for their training, day to day. Now, the truth is, most people neglect all of this stuff because it's not the actual training outcome itself. So we focus purely on that said principle where we focus on the thing that we want to get better at. But the thing is, if you can't do or focus on the outcome, you can't actually train because you're in pain. What's the point? So this is where structural balance comes into it. It's not sexy at all, but it needs to be part of your training program week in, week out. So where does it fall into the ecosystem? How do we make it work? And I've got a few really practical strategies here that you can use to fit it into your training week and year. So the first thing to speak about here is, as you start out as a new lifter, you're probably going to be not needing to focus on like structural balance unless you're coming in from like a rehab pathway. You want to get in, you want to learn a skill, you want to get good at training, right? That's kind of like a non-negotiable there. You don't want to overcomplicate things for the sake of overcomplicating it. As you get better and better and better, training never gets easier. You need better strategies in place to help you moving forward. So this is the trick of where it comes in and where I see it. And most people actually only come on to structural balance after they've had an injury or they've had a period of time where they're not making the progress that they need. So if you are in your journey, you're in pain, you're not making progress, structural balance could be for you. But where it fits in is specific warm-ups, prehab programs, and weak point training. So when you have a look at a training program in general, your warm-up and any weak point stuff that you have in your training program. I actually dedicate and do my training program like this. I have my warm up, and my warm up looks at active and passive movements. So I'm working on mobility, I'm working on range and controlling that range. I actually front load my training sessions with weak point training. Rotator cuff, scapular work, hamstring work, core work. I actually work on all of my weak point training first. Now that is potentially a little bit controversial, but I find I put a lot more effort into it at the front. So having a warm up that's specific to range of movement control and activation, having a weak point training that targets all of your weak point areas. It doesn't have to be at the front of your training program. It could be at the end, as long as it's in there somewhere. And also having, if you are terrible at training core, you're terrible at training calves, you're terrible at training, your rotator cuff, you could pair up a weak point training program on a active recovery day, some day that you're doing like conditioning work or you're just doing some mobility work, for instance. You could have a low level day where you're just working on these smaller exercises to get your whole ecosystem working better as a whole. This way, it actually seamlessly starts to work into your training program. Now, when I say this about my weak point training, for instance, in my program and my prehab programs, a lot of people go, well, I haven't got 30 minutes to dedicate time at the start of my training sessions. I'm like, you don't need to, because how you need to structure these is that they seamlessly work into your training programs. So say, for instance, you come in, you've jumped down and, you're doing some foam rolling, and say you're going to squat. I always use squat as an example, don't I? But say you're going to squat, you've got your barbell set up, you do a set just with the bar, and then you run through, there might be 3 to 5 exercises. You run through those 3 to 5 exercises as a circuit, and then you chuck 40 kilos on the bar. You do a set of squats. You run through another round of these, structural balance exercises, and then you add 60 on, and you just add it into your warm up, because the reality is you're just going to be sitting there scrolling on your phone or looking around the gym anyway. So you may as well use your time in the gym to work through some of these exercises. Now, the added benefit of this as well is your nervous system starts to fire up. Like you're getting active, your body's feeling good, your mind's connecting with the muscles. So actually, as you start to warm up, your body gets really engaged and switched on. So having them at front loading in your training session is actually a really, really cool way of doing things. But also, if that doesn't work for you for whatever reason, just pull it out to the side. Do it on a recovery day, do it on a conditioning day. That is all G. Now, the other thing that I often see as a really, really good strategy. Now, this will actually take a lot more like pre-planning from the coaching side of things. But how I like to look at it is I periodize things throughout the working year, right? So if I've got someone, I know that I'm going to be working with them for 12, 18, 24 months, I can zoom out a little bit and I can take a bit more of an eagle view approach and go, okay, well, these 4 months I'm going to dedicate on this. The next 4 months I'm going to dedicate on this, and so forth. And you can start to plan out specific phases as you go. And across like a 12-month period, 18, 24-month period, you're continually refining and improving on these things. So, for instance, I think an area that's really poorly managed is just the knee. I think people just do not train it that well. People don't train the calf well enough. People don't train the hamstring in different positions enough, and also the glute, right? So having, periods of time, say that first 4 months of your training year, working on really small isolated exercises that just brings up the strength, brings up the tolerance, brings up the muscle mass of those smaller groups, then your phase 2 of that, the next 4 months, for instance, can start to work on integrating that in together, say in a unilateral way, all single limb, working on asymmetry, but making sure that everything's firing and working together again, then moving into something where it's more focused on output. But you still have some of that structural balance stuff trickled through. But the thing with training is, as it progresses through, you have to get more and more specific with what you're doing. So at the very start of a training program, for instance, you're going to be working these smaller, more isolated things where towards the back end, you are going to be a lot more locked in. You are going to be doing bigger compound movements, for instances. So then after you finish that particular phase, that's when you pull back into these more isolated, and you can rinse and repeat that. But the really powerful thing here is like knowing the regression and progression of each exercise category that of what you're actually doing. Because you've got open chain movements, which is you're not fixed to anything, and closed chain movements where you are fixed to things. So part of your program is you want all the isolated components, like in terms of its movement and its function. And then you want to do it in a way that's open chain and closed chain unilaterally and bilaterally, which is single leg and then both legs together. And same again for the upper body. So you actually want to have a systemized way of which you approach it. And then depending on who's in front of you, you can just match that system to that person. So someone might come in super deconditioned or with an injury, and obviously you're going to start them down on the lowest barrier, and then you're going to build them up over time. So each year that goes through, you actually will get better and better and better. So even the exercises in terms of structural balance actually progress, just like your squats, your bench, your deadlift would. So that is a really powerful way to do it. And I think that, if you can get a system working that's good enough that actually structures this in, it works in seamlessly into your day-to-day programs, and you feel good. And to be completely honest with you, some of these exercises are really hard. They're not easy. They're actually really, really hard because it identifies a lot of weakness in the system. So periodizing across a year or 2-year period, whatever it may look like, is a super powerful way of doing it. Then the third is what we call like a variability block. Is often known in the industry. Now, variability blocks is a period of time, each year or after a big event where you would actually focus on purely just breaking things down into a really isolated manner, doing different movement patterns and training different styles than what you have been for a period of time. Now, the goal with these types of training blocks is to expose you to a different type of stimulus. Now, I'm going to use the example of powerlifting here. If you had just done a powerlifting peak and you had dedicated a year of your time to really sort of building up, after that period, you'll want a period of reduced intensity across the board in terms of volume, in terms of intensity, and that is where you would potentially introduce one of these variability blocks. Work on the isolated. It would actually bring down the overall stress of those sessions. It would give you an opportunity to actually then, at the front of everything, and at the front of your focus, put these weak points and build up all the smaller isolated points. And it doesn't mean that you just have to do single, isolated exercise. You will change the type of exercises that you're doing so that your body gets a different stimulus. And we would use exercises which are limited in load purely by position. So say you've been doing back squats, you may use a front squat, for instance, because you're probably going to fail on position in a front squat way before you fail actually on strength, which is actually really, really cool because it's a way of like self-limiting actually doing intensity. But combined with that, we'll actually want a lot of these smaller exercises. Now, like if we think about it, right, how often do you train hip flexion? Probably not that often. How often do you train all the small components of your midsection? Probably not all that often. Rotator cuff, you might chuck a couple of exercises in here and there, but you probably don't spend all that amount of time actually, focusing and progressing these small amounts of muscles. So these small muscle groups. So these variability blocks actually are the perfect opportunity for you to do so. Like you may spend only 4 weeks, you may spend 8 weeks, you may spend 12 weeks, depending on your actual training session schedule. But the reality is they actually serve a really good purpose. And, for someone that may have sustained an injury or something like that, you actually may train in that way and work from almost like a bottoms up approach for like an extended period of time, because often what happens is you'll get an injury and then you'll get 10, right? They just compound. They just stack up one another. And that is there's a glaring sign. It's telling you that there's something in your system that is not firing the way that it should. Okay, so if you have then made the decision, which, is a very, very good decision to sort of go into rebuilding your whole system as a whole and working from the ground up, it actually gives you an opportunity to build yourself up to a point that you were actually better before. And then moving forward from that point, hopefully you should surpass and then continue to make progress year on year. So these are basically where the 3 big categories that I would find the most value for people actually adding it in. So specific warm-ups, prehab programs, and weak point programs. Periodize it across a year and seamlessly add it into your training programs, or actually dedicate chunks of time to moving better. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I've seen my fair share of injuries. I've had my fair share of injuries, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. A lot of the time they could have been prevented, and it's human nature. When things are going well, we don't question it. We just keep riding the wave until something pops up, until an injury kicks in, and it puts it just dampens our spirit. It stops things. And there's nothing more frustrating than wanting to do something and you can't. So often these strategies are put into place once people run into road bumps. And it's like, as a coach, as a practitioner, we try and educate people on this earlier, but people often just do not see the value in it until they've had a significant point of time or an injury where they then need to work from the bottom up. So if you want to start progressing in a way that you can continue to train year on year and significantly decrease injury risk and also increase just overall feeling, there's no point being super strong if you're just in pain all year round. You're struggling, you can't even bend over to tie your shoelace. They're not qualities you want. And this is where the structural balance component of training really, really comes into it. And I'm a big advocate of it. It's not sexy. You're probably not going to see it on Instagram or YouTube, but it is the component. It's the linchpin that holds a whole system together. It's the rehab side of training programs that anyone can do, basically. So I think that's it for me. Hopefully that's a strong use case for where structural balance fits into your training program, because honestly, you're only as good as your weakest link. And, if you improve on your weakest link, you're going to be able to put your best foot forward. So that's it for me, today's episode. I'll see you guys on the next one.